it's unbelievable how many iterations of all these different palettes he was able to manipulate.
Welcome to The Love of Art, the Paraton podcast. Here artists speak about other artists that fascinate them, musicians, writers, filmmakers, actors, designers, in a very personal way. We believe that art belongs to everyone. As French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu wrote in L'Amour de l'Art, culture is not a privilege bestowed by nature. If everyone had the means to obtain it, it would belong to everyone. Danielle Orchard explores the representation of the female form in a multi-perspectival manner. Her figures resist existing solely as psychological portraits or objects for the gaze. Instead, they emerge through a complex orchestration of color, line, and space. While the concept of the female nude is deeply ingrained in art history as a muse and has more recently been established as a subject of study, Orchard adds depth by infusing her own experiences, having trained, posed, and even taught in live drawing classes. In this episode, she talks about the painter Milton Avery. Enjoy!
I was born in Indiana and raised in Indiana and educated in Indiana, primarily. Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is the northern part of the state. And it's similar in character to Detroit, Chicago, not as big as those places, but it's in the kind of Rust Belt. So this sort of like industrial area that was once thriving, but now is kind of on the decline and, but that kind of environment. So not like cornfields when you think Midwest. It's not that kind of Midwest. And art was just always what I did. As a small child, I always drew. I remember thinking I would be an artist someday. And people, I think importantly, told me that I was good at it. I think kids need a lot of praise to believe that they're good at things and to trust that they can do things. I think most people at that age love drawing. I know that my own child loves drawing. And I think it's sort of a shame that people give it up because it's like an important part of being a human being. But I just took to it. I always had a sketchbook. I got art materials for birthdays and Christmas and all of that kind of thing. And after graduating from high school, I went to the state school, which is Indiana University, the only school I applied to, the only school I knew about. And I just happened to enter this amazing painting program that was rather traditional. Like at the time, you were only allowed to use oil paint, and you had to make canvases, like construct them yourself and stretch the canvas, prepare it. It was just an incredible experience, I think, foundationally, because I really understood the material and its possibilities and also its limitations, I think. And I never deviated really from that. I've never painted with anything else. It's always been oil. Not to say that there aren't other options that are just as valid, but that I've just been fairly single-minded. And just great professors who introduced me to amazing artists like Milton Avery. So I learned of his work fairly early in my artistic career. So when I think of my place among like all of my predecessors and my kind of artistic heroes, I don't think of myself as fully separate from them because in my mind they're still so alive, and because of this amazing education. And afterward, I went to Hunter College in New York, studied painting there, which was really just this other kind of education, like learning about the art world and like thriving like contemporary art scene, and then going to the Met and seeing all of all that stuff and like really living with those paintings was just incredible. It was just another layer of education. And then I lived there for a long time, and now I live out in the country and I just paint. And early on in my painting education, I showed some sort of affinity with the Fauvists, and particularly Matisse's work from the Fauvist era. And a professor was like, "Oh, you might like Milton Avery. I should bring in my Milton Avery book." And then, showed me that work. And from there, I've just always loved it. And I always have a few books. I have a lot of art books in the studio that I reference consistently, but there are a few that I just always have open, even if I'm not actively looking at them. I just need them. I need to know that they're there so that if I get stuck in, a color decision or something, I can like, what would Max Beckman do? Or, and I can quickly look at them. Whereas looking on my phone or something just doesn't have that sort of like comforting sensation or something. It's almost like you call up your friend when you're in a panic or something and like, help me out of this. So I just look to my Milton Avery book for a color choice or something like that. Milton Avery's use of color I think I just had a kind of natural proclivity, some kind of like affinity for that use of color, and still do. A lot of the painters I look to are fairly saturated, kind of unusual color choices. I don't think I had the vocabulary at the time to really express what it was that he was doing, like how those, because I hadn't taken a lot of color theory. That sort of came later for me. But I knew that I loved them, and I thought that they were incredibly free, inevitable feeling at the same time. It like could have been any number of choices, but it had to be that one red, that sort of like bluish red. Like that's, I think, where his genius really shines, because they're such simple paintings, really. In terms like the forms are not, but in that sense they're so complex. I mean, they're essentially just very strong abstractions, and I think that's the kind of painting that I'm attracted to. Figurative painting that functions on an abstract level kind of first. And then I learned later that, of course, like that was coming out of Cézanne and Picasso, and that he wasn't the first to do that or anything. But he also felt like this American kind of voice, and they were also like small, they were kind of quiet in their scale. But I definitely remember seeing them in person and thinking these are just as luminous as I thought they would be, that they were a lot sort of flatter in application. They're so rich in color and so rich in depth and atmosphere. And then when you're in front of them, there's not a lot of paint on the surface. It's like incredibly decisive paintings, which is so impressive because they're such strange decisions. To do something, I feel like I arrive at strange color decisions in some of my work when I'm happiest, but it's after a lot of revision. It's after several attempts at finding the color. And that's what's so incredible about him, is that it seems like he lands there first, and it's his first impulse is the strangest one, and then he somehow gets it to work in this incredible harmonious environment. Because I think real artists, it's not really a choice. I mean, it's a compulsion. I think that that's really ultimately what I think talent is just an inescapable urge to do something, because you get better over time, or some people get worse over time. Like sometimes you peak when you're 25 and then, the work suffers later in life, but it's just that lack of, just the inability to quit doing it. Like it's something that you would just kind of lose your mind if you didn't. And I think he's just a real painter and was always a real painter. So Milton Avery's wife and his daughter were both painters and were working in a very similar aesthetic vein. And I just feel like that's such a beautiful thing that they decided not to try to escape his influence, but instead to contribute to it and to, add like their own perspective, and importantly, a female perspective. So they were both subjects of the paintings, but then also like making their own sort of versions of the work and exploring that kind of visual language that, he didn't invent, because no artist invents anything. Everything is kind of pulled from time and then synthesized in some way with one's own experience and like place in the world. There's one painting in particular that I really loved that was like a painting of a therapist's office. And the playing with the scale of figures, it sort of kind of works perspectively, but not really. It's playful, and it almost feels like hierarchy of scale, like you see in Egyptian art, where like the most important figure is exceptionally large and the lowly figures are the smallest. So like deities are huge, and then, like regular people are small. So there's this symbolism in scale, and it's really on view, and it's just very psychologically charged, that painting. I believe that Milton Avery was incredibly influential among his contemporaries, and even though he didn't become a household name like he is today until later in his life, I have read also that he was exchanging ideas, exchanging studio visits with a lot of artists who were younger than himself, older than himself. In a way, I think functioning as a kind of bridge between abstract and figurative painters at the time who, by their own design almost had this kind of rivalry, like an intellectual sort of barrier between them, which we now see as maybe a little absurd, or that it's not so entrenched, or not among my peers anyway. And we see actually that there's a lot of fluidity between abstraction and figuration, and that they're actually kind of inextricably linked, and you can't really pull them apart if you try. But something about the work that he was making, I think, spoke to people who were like Rothko, who was predominantly interested in color, color sensation and visual phenomenon. So I think it's interesting to think that there could be this figure who had very little kind of critical attention, very little financial attention, or like any sort of, he wasn't making a living from his work, but at the same time could talk to all these luminaries and meet them at their level, which is pretty fascinating. I think when an artist has a really profound influence on you, your relationship to that artist changes over time. I think there are certain elements of Milton Avery's work that I wasn't capable of accessing at a very young age. I certainly wasn't capable of articulating some of the color theory that is in those paintings, some of the ways that he manipulates the palette to suggest a certain psychological mood. I don't think that's stuff that I would have understood or been able to name and then want to replicate in my own work. But there was a kind of like freshness and playfulness that I was able to access then. And now I see him as you're always juggling your influences, trying to move away from them a little bit. But then they're so magnetic and they pull you back in. And sometimes a certain body of work that I'm working on, for instance, I'll feel resentful of him because he was so much better at that. And then other times I feel like a kinship. And it's like, oh, we could, I feel like that's true with friendships, as well. Like sometimes you kind of like, there's a contraction and then you kind of come back together, and expansion and contraction over time. He wasn't afraid of any subject, like nothing, he painted fish, he painted nude women, he painted landscapes, he could dip a toe into anything. And I'm envious of that and also just really inspired, and I would love to be that kind of confident. In my own practice, I paint horizontally first by pouring paint onto the canvas while it's on the floor. And that allows for a lot of accidents in the material. And so I just made the conscious choice to use color that I was afraid of, that I find ugly. I'm attracted to really beautiful color. Most people are. And I feel like I'm pretty good at manipulating like a particular palette. And I felt that if I had to start from this position of, discomfort and like a little anxiety around the color, so it was like really unattractive yellows and, things like that, sort of like overmixed, maybe stuff that you wouldn't, like a little muddy. And each canvas was kind of like a different start. All of the canvases were going at once. And yeah, just kind of making that decision to kind of force myself out of my comfort zone in terms of color. I mean, they sort of, because there's so much revision and they often arrive kind of back to the color that I'm better at manipulating, but there's still glimpses of those initial decisions that come through. And I do think that it just kind of, it steers the work of it. Like it steers the narrative. It changes the time of day, which in turn changes the narrative. And yeah, that's something that I'm in no way approaching Milton Avery, but I do think that that's like a lesson that I took from that work.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion with Danielle Orchard on Milton Avery. Please subscribe to our podcast channel and follow us on social media at Periton so you won't miss any episodes or news. See you soon with more artists on the love of art.
But I would love to find out if he had like any particular advice about how to ensure that my child feels free to be an artist if he wants to be an artist. I'd like some advice on that. If anyone out there has any.